When you're a lifter dealing with a serious back injury or even come back from low back surgery, you hear a lot of advice that honestly keeps you farther away from the training that you love. Things like just rest, don't load your spine, or just stick to machines and avoid squats and deadlifts. And the client that I'm about to tell you about had all of that advice. Dustin had low back surgery and went through the typical round of traditional physical therapy. And yeah, it did help him get back to day-to-day life, but he was nowhere close to the level of lifting that he used to enjoy. He was stuck in that frustrating middle ground where he could exercise a little bit, but he couldn't really train, and that honestly really mattered to him. When he reached out to me, he was able to do some really light lifting, but heavy barbell lifting that he actually enjoyed felt completely off limits. He didn't trust his back, he didn't know what movements were safe to do, and even though he desperately wanted to train hard again, he was afraid that one wrong move or one wrong session would just set him back. So he reached out to me and we began working together. But before I wrote a single workout, I took him through a detailed video assessment first. We talked about his surgery, his symptoms, what still bothered him, his training history, what he tried in PT, his goals, preferences, and ultimately what he actually wanted his training to look like in the long term. Then we went through a movement assessment so I could see how he squatted, hinged, how he braced, what his mobility and flexibility looked like, what he could tolerate, and ultimately what positions also felt sketchy during training. And that gave me the roadmap that I needed to design a program that wasn't just safe for Dustin, it was also something he could progress and eventually thrive on and get back to the heavy lifting that he actually loved. And what follows is exactly how we built him back up, block by block, using the training that you can see in this program. Each of Dustin's block had a specific purpose, and each one prepared him for the next block. Block 1 was all about creating safety, predictability, and control. He didn't need heavy lifting yet, he needed to feel in control of the spine and his positioning again. For squatting, we used tempo box squats with a 3-0-3 tempo. The box let him control depth in a way that felt safe, and the slow tempo gave him time to brace, stabilize, and reduce the apprehension that he had developed after his surgery. For hinging, we used light RDLs with a slower 3-0-3 tempo. This avoided the bottom position of the deadlift while rebuilding tolerance to hip hinging with lighter loads. The goal was to teach his hips to move while his spine stayed confident and stable. Core training in this block was intentionally simple and mostly isometric. We did side planks, plank shoulder taps, bird dog rows, dead bugs, and lower intensity anti-rotation work. These drills built lateral, rotational, and extension control without forcing a ton of spinal motion, which is important after surgery. Overall, block 1 was about giving him a foundation. By the end of it, he wasn't afraid to move through squats and hinges, he was starting to trust his back again, and his lower back was able to tolerate more consistent training. Once he had the baseline movement patterns and confidence back, block 2 focused on expanding his movement options with more hip range, better rotational control, and slightly more dynamic trunk training. For squatting, we lowered the box height slightly, and we introduced more unilateral lower body work like deficit reversal lunges and 1.5 rep variations. These forced him to control his pelvis and trunk through deeper hip flexion, which directly helped him with squat depth and lower back confidence. For hinging, we didn't just jump straight to the floor yet, we increased difficulty through things like landmine single leg RDLs and 1.5 RDLs. These variations challenge his hip stability and posterior chain strength without just overwhelming his lumbar spine. And core became a little bit more dynamic with Pallof press plus lift variations, kettlebell dead bugs, half kneel rotations, and Jefferson curls with only body weight. These drills introduced controlled motion through the trunk and hips in multiple planes of motion, which helped him relearn that flexion, rotation, and extension are safe and not inherently dangerous. Block 2 was about building upon the base that we had built in Block 1 and starting to introduce some safe spine movement. And by the end of it, his hip control, trunk stability, and confidence in deeper ranges of motion were significantly better. By block 3, he had the control and confidence that we needed, so we started to actually gradually reduce the constraints and allowed more natural strength training. For squatting, we lowered the box height again and reduced the tempo, which let him feel a more natural squat pattern while staying in a controlled, safe range, but with heavier loads. He also began progressing more advanced unilateral work like deficit split squats and rear foot elevated split squat variations, which improved single leg stability and pelvic control. For hinging, we increased the intensity with heavier RDLs with slower eccentrics, which built tissue tolerance and confidence in deeper hinging positions, which is essential for getting back to deadlifting later in the program. His core training also progressed significantly with things like suitcase marches, half kneeling windmills, more advanced anti-rotation drills, and loaded Jefferson curls. This block was the turning point where he went from just protecting his spine to now actually training again. His trunk wasn't just resisting motion anymore, it was controlling it through large ranges under load. By the end of block 3, his technique, bracing, and hip stability were ready for the next step, which was returning to barbell movement patterns in a more serious way. This block looked much more like a real lifting program, but still with smart tempo and constraint strategies. For squatting, he transitioned tempo back squats without the box, using a 3-0-3 tempo, which was a major step forward, because now he had to own the bottom position without external reference points. This is often the scariest part for people with low back pain or surgery histories, but because of work that we had done in earlier blocks, he handled it totally well. For hinging, we introduced 3-0-3 tempo deadlifts from the floor, which was his first time deadlifting from the ground in this program. The slow tempo forced him to use lighter loads with more control, as well as building up the confidence in his lower back. It also helped him rebuild the tolerance to spinal loading in that range, which had previously made him nervous. Core training in this block became even more dynamic with things like hanging leg raises, heavier cable rotations, weighted planks, suitcase holds, and standing side bend variations. Now he was actually building a trunk that could withstand the real lifting demands, such as resisting shear, handling rotation, tolerating flexion, and generating force under load. By the end of block 4, he was basically a functioning lifter again, not a rehab patient. In block 5 was a transition phase from controlled tempos to more traditional strength training. For squatting, he moved to normal tempo back squats for sets of 8 without any box or tempo restrictions. For hinging, he did normal deadlifts with a 202 tempo, which is still controlled, but much closer to the traditional strength training that he wanted to be doing. And his confidence off the floor improved rapidly. His core training took another step forward with heavy suitcase holds, ab rollouts, high-intensity rotational work, side planks with more demanding variations, hip dips, and deeper range of motion trunk work. The trunk work in this block was about building strength in neutral and non-neutral spine positions, which is a huge step for lifters with a history of back pain or surgery. At this point, he wasn't just tolerating lifting, he was actually starting to push hard again, and block 6 is where everything came together. For squatting, he performed heavy top sets of 5, around 2-3 reps in reserve, followed by back off sets, and he was now lifting weights that required actual effort and confidence. For bench and upper body work, he hit top triples with back offsets, showing that his bracing was solid enough to support full body heavy loading again. And for hinging, he was pulling heavy top sets of 6 with additional back offsets. So this was true strength training, not just rehab. And his core training reached its highest intensity with ab rollouts to near failure, heavier rotational cable work, heavier suitcase holds, and heavier loaded Jefferson curl progressions with high load anti-rotation and anti-extension work. By the end of this block, he wasn't really worrying about his back anymore. He trusted it, his technique was solid, his strength was climbing week to week, and he actually felt like a lifter again. During this block, he told me that this was really the first time since the surgery that he felt like he was actually training and not just doing rehab. And that's exactly what we had built him up towards throughout this 6-month program. If you're a lifter dealing with pain or even recovering from a surgery, this progression shows what's possible when you don't avoid movements, but instead rebuild them intelligently. If you're dealing with an injury, then just click the link below to schedule a free phone consultation to see if I can help you out the same way that I helped Dustin.